I heard that single pop slice through the air, and I just knew. It was damp and foggy and unseasonably cool as I quickly walked towards the rusty shed in my backyard. The door was only slightly opened, but the smell of gunpowder told me exactly what I'd find inside. Now, I'm a trauma surgeon and a hospice doctor, and I've spent the past 2 decades literally running towards death, either into the trauma bay, where I fight like hell to stave off that final moment, or to the bedside, where I work, often just as hard, to help patients and families meet the moment with love and hopefully with some peace. But despite all of my professional experiences, on that quiet spring morning, it was actually a Friday, I quickly realized there was nothing more terrifying than stumbling upon the body of someone I knew and loved, my once healthy, beautiful boyfriend, who is now actively dying from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. In that moment, I ran from death. But as I ran, I told myself, you will make meaning out of this. This was not some random thought. It was born from prior experience because almost 30 years before this suicide, I lost another man to gun violence when my father, Kobe, was shot to death by a terrorist in Cairo, Egypt. In the weeks following my boyfriend's death, I learned while conversations about death and dying and grief and loss had become more popular and more nuanced over the past 30 years, the dialogue around violent death hadn't changed much at all. The same thing I was told when my father was killed, that everything happens for a reason, was repeated to me verbatim 3 decades later when my boyfriend killed himself. What I have come to believe is nothing happens for a reason, but we can make meaning out of everything that happens. And so my purpose today is to introduce the concept of violent death, defined by researchers as a death due to homicide, to suicide, to an accident, or to a disaster, into the ongoing discussions about grief and loss, with the hope that we survivors may be more thoughtfully supported on our lifelong journeys of making meaning out of what is often the worst day of our lives. Now, you may be listening to my story of murder, of terrorism, and insist, but Red, everything really does happen for a reason. I get it. Violent death is sudden and shocking, and I understand the need to impose order onto chaos. But platitudes like this tend to discourage rather than to invite further conversation. And for survivors of violent loss, conversation is essential as we work to make meaning. Or you may be listening to my story of gun violence, of suicide, and exclaim, Red, I can't even imagine what you've been through. I understand you may never, even in your imagination, choose to walk in my shoes. Can you instead try walking alongside me to ease my loneliness and help me feel a little less disconnected? Because connection, too, is essential for meaning making. However, given that over 50% of Americans are survivors of at least one violent death, it's just as likely you are listening to my story and, perhaps for the very first time, you are hearing part of your own. If so, I am so sorry for your loss, and I welcome you to this community. Please know you are not alone. It is estimated when someone dies, between 5 to 9 people are deeply affected. and violent deaths, particularly those due to intentional violence, tend to affect entire communities. Yet, despite this, survivors of violent loss often feel alienated in their grief. Why is this? One reason is the grief following a violent death is remarkably different than the grief following the more common natural death. The differences start almost immediately, often with the involvement of law enforcement. After finding my boyfriend, my yard was flooded with paramedics and policemen. Standing in my stained old pajamas, sweaty, smelly, and slightly hysterical, I felt vulnerable and guilty, scared the police would blame me for this suicide or arrest me for running from my boyfriend's dying body. In the weeks after my boyfriend's death, I became convinced I would lose my medical license, that the board would deem me unfit for practice. I was a physician, but had failed to recognize my boyfriend was suicidal and had failed to protect him from himself. Worse, I was a trauma surgeon and had run from death when it mattered most. And for months after his death, I buried myself into my boyfriend's lazy boy recliner, with my eyes shut tight to picture him, my nose pressed into the cushions to smell him, and my arm thrown around the backrest as if to hug him, torn between an intense desire to see him again and my desperate attempts to escape those awful last images of him. Psychiatrist Edward Reinerson proposed survivors of violent loss often struggle with these two concurrent yet contradictory forms of distress. The first, separation distress, what we all feel when someone we love dies, is marked by thoughts of a reunion and by feelings of longing as the survivor seeks to reunite with a living presence. The second distress, traumatic distress, is unique to violent loss, and it is marked by thoughts of reenacting the death and by feelings of fear as a survivor seeks to avoid the dying presence. Now, in the US, we are far from strangers to violent loss. Gun violence is the leading cause of death in children and teens. Accidents are the fourth leading cause of death in adults, and suicide is the 11th. Yet, it wasn't until I stumbled upon Dr. Reinerson's work that I was finally able to understand these two opposing forms of distress battling within me. Finding the words to express my struggle and learning this struggle was not unique helped me feel more connected to my community and less isolated in my grief. The irony of this isolation is our stories of violent loss often play out in the media for everyone to see and to comment upon. My father was killed in 1993, when terrorism was still a relatively new concept to many Americans. For weeks, his death was featured prominently in the national papers and on the evening news, leaving me feeling exposed, but at the same time, unseen, unheard, and unknown. While I briefly felt united in a national sense of grief and loss, I quickly realized it was only me and my family who were now permanent citizens of this frightening, unpredictable new reality. The media exposure continued on and off for years and escalated when, 4 years after my father's murder, his killer, with the help of his family, escaped from jail and slaughtered 9 tourists and their bus driver. Sitting with my mom in a random hotel room in Portland, Oregon, I turned on CNN and, without any warning, we came face to face with this monster. He was hollering and jumping around, locked in a cage in the middle of a courtroom in Cairo. He was on trial again, and this time was sentenced to death. But unfortunately, after a violent loss, the decision to pursue criminal prosecution is driven by the state rather than by the survivor, and cases are focused on the laws broken rather than on the lives lost. I can attest, survivors often find justice, even when served, a poor antidote to grief. Despite this, some survivors of violent loss do utilize the legal system, an example of what Dr. Marilyn Peterson Armour describes as meaning-making grounded in deliberate action. Dr. Armour, a trauma researcher and herself a survivor of violent loss, has studied intentional forms of meaning-making, which also include living in a way that honors a loved one's legacy. I was 19 when my father was killed, a recent college dropout, struggling to recover from some very poor choices, definitely not living my best life. Despite this, my father's last conversation with his colleagues, one of whom lived to tell me this story, focused on his pride in me. After he died, my desire to keep my father proud of me propelled me through 20 years of school and medical training to the career I have today, caring for trauma patients and their families during the worst days of their lives. Talk about a legacy and talk about making meaning. For other survivors, meaning-making is a more internal endeavor. The desire to make meaning is often born from the struggle to reconcile traumatic images with tender memories, and is driven by the need to construct a narrative connecting our past and our present selves. That narrative, however, is difficult to construct when the words to describe our thoughts and our actions are often beyond our reach. Trauma expert Dr. Bessel van der Kolk explains, when we survive a traumatic event, Broca's area, one of the speech centers in our brain, ceases to function. We store the memory, but cannot translate the memory, nor our feelings about it, into words. EMDR, a psychotherapy treatment combining short discussions of emotionally charged material with bilateral stimulation like eye movements, hand tapping, or audio beats, can be particularly helpful in this area. After my boyfriend's suicide, it enabled me to craft a logical story from the disparate images trapped in my brain. Translating my memories into words created some order in my chaotic mind, leaving me calmer and less reactive. EMDR helped me establish some emotional distance from that awful spring morning and allowed me to slowly make some meaning from that life-altering moment. Today, that meaning stems from my boyfriend's love of his family and extends to my relationships with my family, with my love Charlie, with my friends, with my colleagues, with my patients, and with their families as well. Meaning-making is motivated by personal need, but it is not a private affair and is often done in the context of community. Whether it is grounded in thoughts, in actions, or in a combination of both, survivors need a reassuring and receptive audience to bear witness to this life-affirming work. In terms of community, Ram Dass, the great American spiritual teacher, once declared, "We are all just walking each other home." As a hospice doctor, I've accompanied hundreds of people, often surrounded by friends and family, on the last steps of their journeys. But as a trauma surgeon, I know many other people, up to 10% of the world's population, are forced to take those last steps alone, without warning and often way too soon. For survivors of violent loss, there is often an over-identification with those last awful moments, one that lingers far longer than any of us, myself included, would like. But just as no life should be defined by how it ends, no other life should be defined by what it's lost. Now, I am in no way suggesting we survivors let go of our grief, what Glennon Doyle tenderly refers to as love's souvenir. Rather, I am asking we hold space for the possibility that, over time, meaningful conversations, deep connections, community, and creativity will distill our grief into something greater and will infuse our lives with a richness and a depth that may seem unfathomable, particularly early after a violent loss. I am asking we believe that at some point, the deaths we have endured will no longer define who we are, but instead will inform the many ways we walk through our worlds. This is the beauty of meaning making, the reminder we are all more than the sum of our losses. It may take years or even decades, but at some point, you will no longer feel called to run back towards your version of that rusty shed. And for those of you who know or love a survivor of violent loss, please be patient. Remember, we were robbed not only of our loved ones, but of a basic sense of safety in this very scary world. Come, join us in our rusty sheds. Listen as we speak not only of our lost loves, but of the chaos that ensued in the wake of their deaths. Sit with us. Sit with us again. And when we are ready, stand beside us as we crawl, then stumble, then walk out of that dark, dank space. And know that as our grief changes, and as it ultimately changes us, you too may be changed as well.